At 4 a.m., the faint light of dawn seeped through the curtains. In my groggy state, I noticed my husband, Greg, get up from bed and leave the room. Somewhere in the distance, I could faintly hear the sound of a paper delivery person riding their motorbike. Amid that sound, I also heard Greg quietly making his way upstairs. Greg going upstairs. The only rooms upstairs were the one where we kept our clothes and our high school granddaughter, Christy's room. I was still half asleep, and I figured Greg was just getting up for the bathroom in the middle of the night, so I didn't think much of it and drifted back to sleep. The next thing I knew, the alarm clock by my bed was blaring. It was a regular morning, just another Sunday. Today, I had the day off from work, so I had been doing chores since early morning. Greg came out of the bedroom, putting on his jogging clothes, and started doing some light stretches in the corner of the living room. "Hey, didn't you wake up pretty early today?"
Huh? Oh, yeah, I woke up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom.
"Did you go into Christy's room after that? It was 4 a.m., right?" Greg didn't look at me. After finishing his stretches, he quickly left the house. Just then, Christy came downstairs. Her bangs covered her eyes, but the dark circles under them were hard to miss. "Good morning. Hey, did Grandpa come into your room this morning?"
Yeah. I'm sorry.
"Sorry. Why is she apologizing?" Christy sat down, hunched over, staring blankly at the empty table. She looked exhausted. Sensing the tension, I silently placed a glass of water in front of her. I then headed to the laundry room and started checking the laundry from the hamper, one item at a time. It's a habit of mine. Because a tissue left in a pocket could spell disaster. But when I picked up Christy's pajamas, I froze. "What is this?" "My name is Tina. I live with my husband, Greg, and our granddaughter, Christy, who we've been raising ever since our son and his wife tragically passed away." Greg and I met while working as tutors at a learning center. Greg often told me how much he struggled academically when he was younger. That's why he was passionate about teaching his students, because he doesn't want them to repeat the mistakes he made. Greg used to speak so fervently, saying,
I don't care if they hate me. The strong spirit they'll gain from tough lessons will serve them well in life.
He often yelled at students and made them stay after class until they solved the problems. If they forgot to turn in homework, he'd scold them loudly. In my younger days, I admired Greg for his dedication to the students, thinking he was a wonderful, caring teacher. But that was 14 years ago. One day, a parent of one of his students filed a complaint against him. The head of the learning center called him into a private office and said, "Your teaching methods have gone too far." Greg couldn't defend himself and was eventually forced to quit. He searched for another job but never found a place that appreciated his talents. At the time, Greg was 54 years old. He didn't have the courage to try something new. And eventually, he stopped looking for work altogether, shutting himself inside the house. I couldn't bring myself to blame him. I just wanted to support him. but it was painful to see him sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the wall, as if all life had drained out of him. Still, we needed to make a living. With Greg sinking deeper into depression, I returned to work as a tutor to keep us afloat financially. What finally lifted Greg from his despair was our granddaughter, Christy. 10 years ago, we lost our son and his wife in a tragic accident. At just 4 years old, Christy couldn't understand that her parents were gone, and she cried almost every night. I didn't know what to say to her, so I chose to simply spend those sleepless nights by her side. On those quiet nights, the two of us would look through a butterfly book together. Christy loved that book, and I'll never forget how her tears would fall onto its pages as she stared at the butterflies with all her might. There are so many kinds of butterflies. They are beautiful, aren't they? At the time, I couldn't think of anything else to help distract Christy from her sadness and pain besides looking at the book with her. After taking Christy in, she often missed school, likely due to the emotional scars of losing her parents.
It's fine if she doesn't go to school. I can teach her everything she needs to know,
Greg had said lightly at first. From elementary through middle school, Greg took on the responsibility of teaching Christy whenever she couldn't attend school. Christy was a quiet, reserved girl. She was obedient and straightforward. Losing our son and his wife in a tragic accident was heartbreaking. But I felt like Christy had become Greg's new purpose in life. Whenever I left for work and returned home in the evening, the living room would always be empty. As I quietly made my way upstairs to Christy's room, I'd hear Greg's voice, softly guiding her through her studies.
Now, you see, this problem can be solved using this equation.
Though I couldn't see Greg's face through the door, I could tell from the energy in his voice that he was alive again. I'd start preparing dinner. In the neatly cleaned kitchen, Greg always made sure the house was spotless. As I took out the frying pan and started cooking, the smell of food would fill the air, and soon enough, Greg and Christy would come downstairs. Greg, full of enthusiasm, would say,
Tina, listen. Christy is so sharp and quick to learn. I'm sure she'll become a scholar one day.
"Wow, that's amazing, Christy, you're doing so well." Hiding behind her long bangs, Christy would shyly lower her head, clearly a bit embarrassed. I believed that these peaceful days would continue forever. But when Christy became a high school sophomore, the atmosphere in our home began to change.
If you can even understand this problem, you're definitely going to fail your exams.
Greg's booming voice could be heard clearly from downstairs. Right now, Greg is tutoring in Christy's room. Christy had remained quiet and introverted, but by then, she was attending school regularly. She went to a well-regarded local high school, and both Greg and I had high hopes for her future since her grades were good.
No, that's wrong. Look at the problem more carefully.
Starting to worry, I went upstairs and knocked on Christy's door.
What's going on?
Greg answered the door, not Christy. Feeling hesitant, I stepped into the room. There was Christy, hunched over her desk, her face close to her notebook. The way she sat, gave off an overwhelming sense of exhaustion, so I softly spoke to her. "Why don't you take a break?" After a moment of hesitation, Greg turned to Christy.
Let's take a break.
We all went down to the living room. I had prepared Christy's favorite cake, and the coffee was already brewed. Greg took a seat, immediately sipped his coffee, and let out an exaggerated sigh.
You're in your second year of high school, Christy. This is the most critical time. Back in the day, we used to say, 4 hours of sleep gets you into college. 5 hours gets you failure.
That's a pretty old school way of thinking. I wonder how it is nowadays.
When you're young, your body can handle it. Push yourself, study hard, and get into a top university. If you get into a top company, you'll have a top future.
Quietly, I brought my mug of coffee to my lips. A top future. I didn't think Greg was wrong. But when I thought about what really drove his intense passion, it made me a bit sad. Greg didn't graduate from college. I knew he carried a deep sense of inadequacy because of that. Even when he worked as a tutor, he'd often say he had the lowest level of education among his colleagues. He didn't want his beloved granddaughter, Christy, to experience the same sense of humiliation. Only I could see the depth of that feeling in him. Greg's teaching style was tough. Even though I wasn't directly involved, I knew it, but with the entrance exams approaching, I didn't think to stop him. I think this is the most important time for studying in your life. So, give it everything you've got, Christy. Christy lowered her head, not responding. She didn't even touch the cake she usually loved. Instead, she clasped her hands tightly under the table. I suddenly noticed that she was biting her lip. "Christy, are you okay?"
I'm fine.
Her voice was hoarse as she responded. Christy had always been introverted, struggling to express her feelings. After eating half of the cake, she said she'd save the rest for later and put it in the fridge. She poured herself a glass of water and was about to head back upstairs when Greg called her back.
Make sure to complete up to problem 20 in the application section. I'll be back in an hour to check.
Christy didn't respond verbally, only nodded slightly to acknowledge his request. She seemed a little off. Christy used to love studying when she was younger. Whenever she scored 100 on a test, she'd proudly show it to me and Greg, beaming with joy. Now I wondered if she was just tired. Maybe she needed a break. I thought about suggesting we go shopping together soon to lift her spirits. One night, I woke up when I sensed Greg pulling the covers off and quietly slipping out of the room. It was 4 a.m., and the faint light of dawn filtered through the curtains. In my groggy state, I glanced at Greg, and for a split second, his eyes seemed to gleam with an eerie light. It might have just been my imagination. But for some reason, I had a bad feeling, so I forced my heavy body to get up. I listened closely. I heard what sounded like Greg flushing the toilet, so I climbed back under the covers. Oh, he just got up to use the bathroom. Somewhere in the distance, I could faintly hear the sound of a newspaper delivery bike. Amidst that, I heard Greg quietly making his way upstairs. Pop Greg, going upstairs. The only things upstairs were the room where we stored our clothes and Christie's room. Why would he go upstairs so early in the morning? I drifted back to sleep while wondering about it, and the next moment, my alarm clock blared. Instinctively, I reached out and turned it off. I gently placed the clock back in its spot and looked over at Greg, still sound asleep beside me. I got up and started preparing breakfast. It was a regular morning, just another Sunday. Today, I had the day off from work, so I had been doing chores since early morning. Greg had his morning routine of going for a walk. He came out of the bedroom, putting on his jogging clothes, and started doing some light stretches in the corner of the living room. I placed the newspaper I had just picked up from the mailbox on the table and casually asked Greg, "Hey, didn't you wake up pretty early today?"
Huh? Oh, yeah, I woke up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom.
"Did you go into Christie's room afterward? It was 4 a.m., right?" Greg didn't look at me as he continued stretching his back.
I was just checking on her studies.
Checking on her studies. At 4 a.m. Questions filled my mind, but before I could ask more, Greg finished his stretches and quickly left the house. Christy came down from upstairs right after. Her bangs hung down to her eyes, but the dark circles under them were hard to miss. "Hey, you've been studying since early, huh? Is your body holding up okay?"
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Why is she apologizing? I wasn't blaming her for anything. Christy sat down, hunched over, staring at the empty table. She looked exhausted. She must have been studying late into the night and finally taken a break. I didn't want to bother her too much, so I quietly placed a glass of water in front of her. I headed to the laundry room and started checking the day's laundry piece by piece. As was my habit. This habit started long ago because my late son used to leave tissues in his pockets, which would ruin the laundry. Now, there's no one left in the house who would do that, but habits are hard to break. I froze as I picked up Christy's pajamas. What is this? There was a faint red stain, like blood, on the sleeve of her polka dot pajamas. When I turned them inside out, I saw blood on the back, too. Furrowing my brow, I fought for a moment, then tossed the clothes into the washing machine. Our house has a balcony on the second floor, but last year we added a wooden deck since climbing stairs will get harder as we age. It's so convenient to step outside from the living room and relax, and the steps of the deck are the perfect height to sit on. Christy was sitting there. Even though it was sweltering outside, she sat quietly, sweating as she gazed out at the garden. The ground in the garden was a little wet. She must have watered it to cool things down. "Christy, it's hot out here. Why don't you come inside?"
No. I'm waiting.
Waiting for what? The water droplets sparkled in the sunlight over the neatly trimmed grass. Christy didn't answer my question, so I didn't press her, and I sat next to her and looked out at the garden. "Christy, there was some blood on your pajamas. What was that about?" I asked casually. I figured it was probably just a nosebleed or something like that, given the heat. But Christy's expression immediately changed. She looked at me with a mix of shock and fear, then hugged herself and began trembling. "What's wrong? What happened?" Startled by Christy's sudden change, I reached out to touch her shoulder. But she recoiled and swatted my hand away, her face contorted.
Don't touch me.
Confused and unsure of what was happening, I just stood there. After a while, Christy silently rolled up the sleeve of her t-shirt. "Wait, is that?" Her shoulder was bruised, a painful purple mark. Tears welled up in her eyes as she showed it to me. I quickly wrapped my arms around her, gently stroking her hair. For a while, we just held each other without speaking, and then, in a hoarse voice, Christy began to tell me that Greg had been coming into her room almost every morning for the past month. It turns out Greg had been going to Christy's room every morning to bring her a set of problems he had created. And she wasn't allowed to leave or do anything else until she solved them. If she made mistakes, he would scold her. She confessed that when I wasn't home, he became even more intense, forcing her to study in a harsh tone, and if she got a question wrong, he'd hit her on the arm or back.
It's my fault. I'm sorry. I need to finish the problems before Grandpa gets back.
Christy stood up to go back to her room, but I grabbed her arm without thinking. She looked down at me with fear in her eyes. I always knew Greg was passionate about education. His teaching was always intense, and he had a way of pushing people to their limits. But I never realized it had gone as far as physical punishment. I couldn't believe he would force his own granddaughter to study to the point of leaving bruises on her body. Holding Christy's arm, I couldn't help but cry. "You were scared. It was hard for you." Thinking about how Christy always felt while sitting at that study desk made my eyes well up with tears. "Sorry, I'm so sorry, Christy, I'm sorry, I'm really sorry." Holding Christy's hand tightly, I apologized to her. The melody from the wall clock in the living room chimed. I lifted my face, quickly wiped my tears, and stood up, returning to the living room while still holding Christy's hand. I grabbed my bag and took out a case containing items like the insurance card from the dresser, then looked Christy in the eye and spoke clearly. "Christy, let's go."
Where to?
"I don't know where, but Greg will be back soon. Let's leave the house before that." Christy looked down, rubbing her hands over her stomach. I wondered if she was confused, not knowing what to do. Maybe she was too scared of Greg's physical punishment to run away, even fearing to escape. I put on as cheerful a face as I could and smiled at Christy. "It's okay, I'll definitely protect you." So, Christy and I decided to leave the house with just our simple belongings. We took a taxi from home to the station, then transferred trains several times to head to a distant town. We went to my sister and her husband's house, with Christy continuing to look down with a worried expression. Before leaving, I called and briefly explained the situation. Upon learning the situation, my sister and her husband, who are usually calm, frowned and guided Christy to another room to help her calm down. When Christy was gone, my sister suddenly showed anger, clenching her fist and muttering,
I absolutely cannot forgive him.
and that they were willing to let us stay here as long as needed. I was truly grateful. My smartphone vibrated, and when I looked at the screen, Greg's name was displayed. I hesitated a bit, but decided to answer the call.
Hey, Tina, where have you gone? Christy is with you, right? You haven't even made progress on the problem set, so where are you taking her?
Don't you understand what you've done? On the other end of the phone, unseen, Greg sighed. He began speaking in a tone that insulted Christy, calling her stupid, and mockingly said, "You probably ran away to your sisters, didn't you?"
Christy said I was being violent, didn't she?
Yes, bruises on her shoulders and back, right, don't you understand what you've done?
You're the one who doesn't understand. Tina, we don't have any children. The only one we can rely on for our old age is Christy. You know?
I didn't understand what Greg was saying, and was at a loss for words. Greg's reasoning was this. He was using violence against Christy to make her enter a top university and get a top job. And after securing a stable income, she would look after our old age. He passionately argued that this was necessary pain not only for studying but also to make Christy mentally stronger. His words, bordering on madness, left me speechless. You hurt Christy for something like that?
I can't discuss this over the phone. I'm coming over there, and I'll bring her back.
I could hear his heavy breathing before the phone call abruptly ended. Dropping my shoulders, I put my phone back into my bag. It would take at least 2 hours, no matter how Greg traveled from our house to my sister's. Even if he rushed, I felt like we still had time.
If you're planning to leave him, I'll support you.
Yeah, I'll go check on Christy. When Christy was little, she used to stay here during holidays like Thanksgiving. There's a guest room, and Christy instinctively headed there without needing to be told. I walked down the hall, around the corner, and opened the door, catching the faint smell of old books. Inside was a large bookshelf lined with older books. On the lower shelves, there were encyclopedia sets that every household seemed to have, next to a series of nature books. Christy had fallen asleep by the window, her thick butterfly encyclopedia still open on her lap. She must have been exhausted. I decided to let her sleep for now. Without saying a word, I returned to the living room. Encouraged by my sister, I began discussing what we should do next. I can't forgive him for hurting Christy, no matter what his reasons were, no matter what remorse Greg shows, I just can't forgive him. My sister and her husband listened carefully to what I had to say. Mixed in were probably some complaints I had been holding onto for years. I let it all out, starting with my frustration over Greg's decade-long unemployment, his extreme approach to education, and the fact that I hadn't been able to stop it myself. It felt like a confession in front of my sister and her husband. After a while, the doorbell rang. When my sister answered, there was Greg hanging his head down and handing over a box of sweets. When he saw me, Greg's expression darkened, and he quickly said,
Let's go home, Tina.
I'm going to stay here for a while. And I'm divorcing you.
What? Is this because I was strict with Christy?
The way he softened his words, calling it strict, was probably because my sister and her husband were nearby. I didn't bother correcting him. But I had no intention of forgiving him. I couldn't even stand to look at him. Greg fell silent at the entrance. He stared at his hands and eventually gave a bitter laugh.
Christy doesn't have parents anymore. We're her only family. It's a parent's fault if a child doesn't study. If Christy's grades slip, there's no one else left to blame.
What are you talking about? I don't understand a word of this.
It's all for Christy. I know she hates me. But Tina, are you going to reject me too? Am I going to be left alone again, just like before?
That's right. 14 years ago, a single complaint from a student's parent had cost Greg his job at the tutoring center. He fell into despair, suffering in the dark, and it was Christy who had pulled him out of it. Maybe Christy had been desperately trying to bring light to Greg's darkness. I lifted my head and took a step toward Greg. At that moment, my sister grabbed my arm. Her expression was stern, her gaze suspicious.
Enough of this charade. This isn't about being hated. The issue is the violence, the fact that there are bruises.
This isn't any of your business. It's a family matter.
You just used Christy for your own selfish reasons. No matter what excuses you have, there's never a valid reason for her to be hurt.
I didn't.
Listen, if you keep pushing, we'll have to handle this professionally, not as family. You better keep that in mind.
Greg fell silent, unable to respond. My sister and her husband, both of them are actually law enforcement officers. I didn't want Greg to end up dealing with the police in a formal complaint. And though my sister and her husband appeared calm, I could feel their anger simmering beneath the surface. I had already made up my mind about the divorce. Greg was reluctant at first, but my sister and her husband convinced him. My sister's final words, that it was better for him to agree to the divorce quietly, rather than have the situation with Christy become public, were what finally convinced him. Grudgingly, Greg agreed, divided the assets, and moved out. Afterward, I heard that Greg was living off his pension in an old apartment. I don't know what he thinks of his future, but something tells me his end will be a lonely one, and I couldn't help but feel a little sad. After the divorce, Christy and I returned to our home, choosing to live just the two of us. When I told Christy she didn't need to worry about studying for exams anymore, she looked visibly relieved. But it seemed like the emotional scars were still there, as Christy struggled to sleep at night. Now, she's attending counseling, and I'm taking things slow, letting her decide what to do next. If she wants to go to college later, that's fine. If she wants to get a job, that's fine too. And if she doesn't want to do anything, that's okay as well. She's young, she can take her time to figure it out. Another hot summer has come around. Christy sits quietly on the deck, gazing out at the garden, with a thin cushion under her to shield from the heat of the wooden boards. I was watering the many plants that surrounded the house with a hose. It's hot out here, Why don't you come inside?
No, I'm fine. I'm waiting here.
I almost asked, waiting for what, but stopped when I saw Christy's eyes widen. She quickly slipped into her sandals and, while looking up at the sky, walked toward the garden. Her heels hung off the back of the old sandals. When did she grow so much? In front of her, 2 black butterflies fluttered around, then finally settled on the lawn to drink from the water droplets. Every summer, these black swallowtail butterflies come to drink water in our yard, sometimes wandering over from the nearby woods. Christy walked toward them, and the 2 butterflies flitted around her a few times before returning to the grass to drink.
Grandma,
Yes.
please, live a long life.
I gently wrapped my arms around Christy's frail body. She's so thin, I need to make sure she eats more, I thought to myself. Someday, I'll be gone from this house before she is. What can I do to make sure, when that day comes, Christy won't be overwhelmed by sadness? The butterfly encyclopedia Christy had left open on the deck rustled in the breeze, its pages flipping back and forth. Eventually, the 2 black butterflies beat their wings and flew off beyond the fence. As I watched them go, I whispered softly, "Don't worry, I'll make sure everything is okay."